My name is Emma Carter. Go ahead and pour yourself a warm cup of coffee, pull up a chair, and get comfortable because we need to talk about something heavy. We need to talk about the exact cost of making yourself small so someone else can feel big. If you have ever lived in a house built entirely on your own silent sacrifices, sweating over the foundation, while someone else stands out front waving at the neighbors, then you already know how this story feels. You know that ache. But do you know what happens when the wool finally falls from your eyes? Let's go back to that Tuesday afternoon. It was mid-February, the air in Connecticut was biting and gray, and I was walking into the central glass atrium of Harlow Reed Technologies. The building was a masterpiece of polished concrete floors, soaring skylights, and living green walls that smelled faintly of expensive jasmine. It felt more like a boutique hotel than a corporate headquarters. I was holding a slim, leather-bound box in my right hand containing a rare vintage timepiece alongside a set of custom leadership plaques I had commissioned weeks prior. I was there to surprise my husband, Julian. It was the afternoon of his official appointment to senior managing partner, a milestone that allegedly marked the absolute pinnacle of his professional life. I had spent the morning imagining the look of pride on his face when he saw me standing there, a quiet witness to his victory. Instead, when I reached the executive floor, the entire corridor was eerily quiet. The main reception desk was empty, a headset sitting abandoned next to a half-empty glass of sparkling water. I walked down the hallway toward the private boardroom, noticing that the heavy wood-paneled doors were closed, and the thick linen blinds had been pulled tightly shut. But I could hear muffled laughter through the glass. I could hear the high-pitched clinking of crystal flutes and the low, resonant rumble of Julian's signature public voice. Thinking it was just an impromptu toast with the internal team, I reached out, pushed the heavy brass handle, and slipped the door open just a few inches. The words I was about to say died instantly in my throat. There was a tight circle of 8 people gathered around the mahogany table. At the center stood Julian. He looked immaculate in his custom charcoal suit, his hair perfectly parted, his smile wide and blinding, but his hand wasn't resting on his notes or his champagne glass. His fingers were tightly, intimately interlaced with those of Victoria, the brilliant, 30-something venture capitalist we had brought into the firm just 6 months ago to spearhead our institutional funding round. As I watched, frozen in the narrow gap of the doorway, Julian raised his glass with his free hand, looked directly into Victoria's eyes, and spoke into the microphone of the boardroom speaker system. "To our joint future," he said, his voice dripping with a warmth he hadn't brought home to our dinner table in over a year. Both inside these walls and far beyond them, we built the architecture, now we own the sky. The room erupted into polite, knowing applause. Victoria leaned in, her sharp blonde bob brushing his shoulder, and pressed a familiar, practiced kiss against his cheek. My heart didn't just break in that corridor. It experienced a kind of instant, absolute thermal shock. The warmth drained out of my fingertips so fast it felt physical. I looked down at the leather watch box in my hand, then back through the glass at the man I had shared a bed with for 14 years. In that precise second, I didn't scream. I didn't burst through the doors, throw the custom plaques across the room, or give the independent board members a theatrical show to gossip about over their evening martinis. When heartbreak gets clean enough, it doesn't make a sound. It doesn't cry for attention. It simply turns around, steps back onto the elevator, and lets the glass doors slide shut. As the elevator descended toward the parking garage, the raw, suffocating grief inside me began to harden into something entirely different. It became an icy, clinical focus. I realized that the man celebrating upstairs didn't just think he had successfully hidden an affair. He thought he had successfully erased me from the very blueprint of the empire we built together. I sat in my car for a long time, listening to the hum of the engine, looking at my hands on the steering wheel. They weren't shaking anymore. They were perfectly still, cold as stone. I drove back to our house in Westport, a beautiful, sprawling colonial property surrounded by bare maple trees that sat like skeletal sentinels against the gray February sky. This was a neighborhood where people pretended not to notice things while noticing everything. A town where wealth was measured by how quiet you could keep your disasters. I walked inside, kicked off my heels, and sat down at the kitchen island. The leather watch box sat right in front of me on the marble counter, right next to a vase of white roses that suddenly felt like a mockery. I took a slow sip of my coffee, staring out the window at the frozen garden, and I forced myself to remember. I forced myself to look back at the foundation of the life we had built, because when you are betrayed so completely, your mind naturally tries to rewrite history to make the present make sense. You ask yourself, when did the cracking start? Was it a year ago, 5 years ago, or was the flaw baked into the very first brick we laid? If you have ever dimmed your own light so someone else could shine, telling yourself that it was just teamwork, or that marriage means sacrificing your ego for the collective good, I want you to listen to me very closely. Never assume that the person you are building a dream with sees the blueprint the same way you do. 14 years ago, Harlow Reed Technologies didn't exist in a glass skyscraper with a living green wall and a boutique reception area. It existed on a scratched-up folding table in the corner of a cramped, drafty apartment that smelled permanently of cheap espresso and damp winter coats. Julian didn't know how to write a single line of robust back-end code. He didn't understand algorithmic distribution, database scaling, or data structures. But he had an undeniable magnetic charisma. He could walk into a room of cynical, tight-fisted investors, flash that wide, practiced smile, and make them believe that a half-baked piece of medical tracking software was going to revolutionize the global healthcare industry. I was the opposite. I hated the spotlight. I preferred my privacy, my quiet corner, my absolute focus. While Julian was out at expensive dinners, selling the vision, I was the one sitting up until 4 a.m, my eyes burning from the glare of dual monitors, engineering the actual product he was selling. I built the entire core architecture from scratch. Every data pipeline, every security protocol, every proprietary algorithm that kept hospital records from crashing was stamped with my digital signature. We were an incredible team back then, or at least, that was the story I told myself. He was the voice. I was the spine. He brought in the money. I built the asset that justified it. I still remember one specific night in the winter of 2013, when we were running on less than 3 hours of sleep, trying to hit a critical deployment deadline. The Wi-Fi in our rented office above a dental clinic in Stamford had gone out again, and the room was so cold we could see our own breath. Julian had walked over, wrapped his heavy wool coat around my shoulders, and sat down on the concrete floor right next to my chair. He squeezed my hand, looked up at me with eyes that seemed completely full of devotion, and whispered, "Every single line of code you write tonight, Emma, is a brick in our forever home. We're building an empire, just you and me. I'm out there fighting the world, so you can build our future in peace. I will never let anyone forget what you did for us." That memory sat in my mind like a parasite, feeding on my current reality. It was a beautiful lie, wrapped in the language of partnership. Back then, I took his words as an expression of romantic protection. I truly believed he was shielding me from the brutal, exhausting politics of the corporate tech sector because he loved me. I didn't see the slow, calculated construction of the cage he was placing me in. Even my father had fallen into the trap of Julian's golden tongue, though only to a point. When the company needed its first massive round of seed capital to survive, my father was the one who signed the check. He didn't do it because he trusted Julian's business acumen. He did it because he trusted my mind. I remember him sitting at our old kitchen table, his fountain pen poised over the document, looking past Julian straight into my eyes. Julian had gone to the bathroom, leaving the two of us alone for just a brief minute. My father leaned over, tapped the paper with his index finger, and said in a low, serious voice, "I'm backing your brain, Emma." Not his mouth. "The money goes into a private..." family holding company that you control entirely. Marriage is a beautiful thing, daughter, but equity is a permanent thing. Don't ever let him talk you out of your leverage. Those were some of the last words he ever spoke to me before he passed away, and thank God I listened to him. Thank God that beneath all my romantic naivety, I kept that one single boundary intact. Over the next decade, as Harlow Reed grew from 12 people to over 200, through multiple funding rounds and corporate restructurings, that private family holding company grew along with it, quietly maintaining a massive, immutable stake in the business. But as the money poured in, Julian's language began to shift, softly at first, like a slow tide eroding a shoreline until you wake up one day and realize the beach is completely gone. Julian didn't lock me out of the company overnight. He was far too smart for a clumsy, dramatic move like that. Instead, he used the seduction of privacy. He turned my natural preference for staying out of the public eye into a weaponized form of care. I remember the exact corporate jargon he used about 6 years ago when we were preparing for our first major institutional press tour. He sat across from me in our Westport kitchen, pouring me a glass of wine, his face full of intense, earnest concern. "Emma, the tech venture space is incredibly toxic and superficial right now," he had said, smoothing down the front of his designer shirt. "Investors in this climate are rigid. They want a single, aggressive, 24/7 operational voice that they can feature on magazine covers and call the sole founder. If they see a married couple running things behind the scenes, they start worrying about emotional volatility and domestic risk. Let me take the heat, the exhausting interviews, and the public scrutiny. I'm doing this to protect your peace so you can guide our macro strategy from the board level without the noise." It sounded so logical, so deeply protective. He made me feel like my anonymity was an elite strategic advantage, a luxury that he was sacrificing his own privacy to afford me. So, I nodded. I agreed to let my name be left off the press releases. I stayed home during the tech summits in Miami and the champagne toasts in Manhattan. And because I told myself that marriage wasn't a petty competition for public credit, I quietly sat in the background while Julian became a regular fixture in business profiles. I watched him pose for portraits beneath bold headlines that labeled him the visionary medical data pioneer who reinvented healthcare tracking single-handedly. Every time someone praised him at a dinner party as the sole architectural genius behind Harlow Reed, I would catch his eye across the room. He would give me a tiny conspiratorial wink, as if to say, "Our little secret." I comforted myself with that wink. I told myself that as long as my husband knew the truth, the rest of the world didn't matter. But a lie repeated 1,000 times eventually becomes the room you live in. Over the years, Julian slowly trained the entire company, and eventually himself, to believe his own marketing. The new employees we hired didn't even know who I was. To the fresh-faced project managers, the operations teams, and the aggressive new legal counsels, I wasn't the brilliant software engineer who had spent her youth building the very marrow of the platform. I was just the founder's quiet, elegant wife who occasionally showed up to corporate charity galas and smiled politely at the staff. Julian's smart, slow-drip erasure of my presence reached its absolute peak when he hired Victoria 18 months ago. Victoria was a force of nature, 10 years younger than me, razor-sharp, with a blunt blonde bob and an effortless corporate confidence that commanded every boardroom she walked into. Julian introduced her to me at a fundraising dinner as the missing piece, who would take Harlow Reed to a multi-billion-dollar valuation. I remember looking at the two of them standing side by side that night under the ballroom lights, both of them dressed in immaculate, custom-tailored suits, speaking the same fast-paced language of market metrics and capitalization tables. They looked like they belonged on a stage together. Meanwhile, I was sitting at the table in a simple knit dress, realizing with a sudden, sharp pang of emotional isolation that Julian hadn't looked at me with that level of professional fascination in a decade. He had entirely stopped discussing the software with me, Whenever I asked about our latest data synchronization upgrades, he would pat my knee condescendingly and say, "Don't stress your head with the day-to-day operations, sweetie. Victoria and I have the execution completely handled. You just enjoy the life we built." He had completely internalized the myth he created. He truly believed that because he was the one holding the microphone, he was the one who owned the stage. He assumed that because I had chosen a quiet life, I was a passive creature who wouldn't notice when he began rearranging the furniture of our entire marriage and our company right under my nose. He didn't realize that the architecture he prided himself on controlling was still anchored to the very foundation I held in my hands. I sat there at my kitchen table in Westport, watching the shadows of the bare maple trees lengthen across the marble counter. The house was completely silent, save for the rhythmic, soft snoring of Murphy, our aging golden retriever, who lay curled up on his rug by the pantry. The luxury watch box and the custom leadership plaques still sat exactly where I had dropped them. It's funny how objects can lose their meaning in an instant. Just hours ago, those plaques were meant to represent a shared triumph. Now, they looked like heavy brass artifacts from a life I didn't live anymore. If you have ever had to sit in the quiet wreckage of your own trust, staring at the physical pieces of a betrayal, and choose, right in that very moment, whether you are going to let your emotions make you scream or let your intelligence make you think, I want you to take a second. Pause. If this hits home for you, type the word strength in the comments right now. Because choosing to think when your heart is actively breaking is one of the hardest things a person can ever do. My phone was sitting face down on the counter, vibrating almost continuously. The screen would light up every few minutes with Julian's name, displaying the photo I had never changed. A snapshot of him from years ago, wearing an old navy sweater, smiling at me from the deck of our very first house. That was before the gray at his temples, before the expensive watches, and before his ambition had fully hardened into entitlement. I didn't pick it up. I didn't send a furious, reactive text message demanding an explanation. I didn't call him crying. When you see a betrayal that is that absolute, that rehearsed, your perspective undergoes a radical structural shift. I realized that if I confronted Julian right then, he would immediately slip into his well-worn crisis management mode. He would use his vintage charm, his corporate vocabulary, and his practiced emotional gaslighting to tell me it was an initialization error, a joke, a temporary lapse in judgment, or a strategic performance for the investors. He would try to manage me the same way he managed a difficult quarterly board meeting. And I refused to be managed. The raw, suffocating grief that had tightened my chest in the glass corridor of the office began to distill into an incredibly cold, clinical focus. Rage, when it becomes clean enough, stops making noise. It stops breaking dishes and throwing tantrums. It becomes structured. I looked at the kitchen island, at the handwriting on the greeting card I had meticulously written out that morning, and I realized something that chilled me far more than the kiss I had witnessed through the boardroom glass. Julian didn't just think he was cheating on his wife. He genuinely believed that because he had successfully hidden me from the public eye for so long, I had lost the capacity to defend myself. He thought my silence was weakness, rather than a deliberate choice to let him lead. He had no idea that while he was busy mastering the art of the spotlight, I had spent 14 years mastering the architecture of the system that kept his spotlight turned on. I stood up, walked over to my desk in the study, and opened my personal laptop. I didn't log into the company's shared network or check Julian's calendar. Instead, I bypassed the standard channels entirely and pulled up the encrypted digital vault of Carter Family Holdings, the private investment vehicle my father had built for me before he passed away. It was time to look at the cold, hard numbers that lay beneath the beautiful illusion of our marriage. I didn't call a divorce attorney first. That would have been a standard emotional reaction, and it would have tipped Julian off that I was acting from a place of marital heartbreak. Instead, I bypassed the traditional matrimonial lawyers and placed a direct, confidential call to Martin Keller. Martin wasn't just a corporate attorney. He had been my father's primary legal counsel and trusted advisor for nearly 30 years before he became mine. He was the one who helped structure the foundational framework of Carter Family Holdings. When Martin answered the phone, his voice was warm, but it shifted instantly when he heard the absolute flatness in my tone. "Emma," he said, sounding immediately alert. "What's wrong? You sound like your father when a major acquisition was going sideways." "Julian is attempting a structural recapitalization of Harlow Reed," I said, leaning back into my leather office chair, my eyes fixed on the rows of encrypted corporate filings loading onto my dual monitors. "And he's doing it with Victoria Blake. I need an immediate, exhaustive forensic audit of the corporate holding company assets. And Martin, it needs to be completely silent. No one inside the executive suite can know we are looking." There was a long pause on the line, the kind of silence that only happens when a seasoned corporate lawyer realizes a massive storm is about to roll in. "Are you sure about this, Emma? Initiating a private holding audit without executive disclosure is a highly aggressive maneuver. It will trigger a massive internal review if he tries to move capital." "Do it," I replied coldly. Over the next 4 hours, while Julian was desperately trying to call my personal cell phone, leaving 152 missed calls that I completely ignored, Martin and his elite team of forensic analysts ripped through the encrypted layers of Harlow Reed's corporate history. Because I held the primary administrative digital tokens for the original family holding company, we didn't need Julian's permission to look at the books. And what we found shattered whatever lingering fragments of my marriage remained. Julian hadn't just started an intimate affair with Victoria. They had been working together for months on a highly sophisticated, deeply manipulative corporate restructuring plan. Victoria wasn't just bringing in institutional venture capital. She and Julian had quietly drafted an agreement to create a secondary expansion portfolio. Under the guise of bringing in fresh institutional capital to scale our healthcare data analytics, Julian was planning to issue a massive batch of new preferred voting shares directly to Victoria's investment group. The math was devastatingly clear. If that share issuance went through, the original equity block held by Carter Family Holdings would be systematically diluted. Julian was attempting to quietly wash away my family's historic veto power and reduce my majority stake down to a powerless minority footnote. He had used his public platform, his magazine covers, and his self-created myth as the sole visionary founder to convince the independent board members that I was a completely passive partner who would simply rubber stamp whatever digital proxy form he put in front of me, just like I had done for years. He had built a highly intelligent layered trap. He assumed that because I loved him, and because I had chosen to live a quiet life in Westport, I wouldn't bother to read the multi-page addendums attached to the standard annual corporate filings. He thought he could steal the entire kingdom I built, hand the keys to his new partner, and leave me with nothing but a beautiful house and a collection of old memories. But Julian made one fatal operational error. In his supreme arrogance, he forgot that a master storyteller is nothing without the person who wrote the language they are speaking. He didn't realize that the very bylaws protecting Carter Family Holdings weren't written by a standard corporate template. They had been drafted by my father, a man who knew exactly how dangerous an ambitious man with a golden tongue could become when he starts believing his own lies. By 7:15 that evening, the trap Julian had set for me was ready to be sprung, except he didn't realize the teeth of the machine were suddenly pointing at him. He had scheduled an emergency, late-evening virtual board meeting for 7:30 p.m. to finalize Victoria's capital injection. It was structured as a swift, routine digital vote. In Julian's mind, this was the final administrative hurdle. He assumed I was sitting at home in Westport, crying into a glass of wine, entirely incapacitated by the emotional shock of what I had seen in the corridor earlier that afternoon. He figured my digital proxy would automatically roll over to his control, as it had for nearly a decade, whenever I skipped operational sessions. At exactly 7:28, I opened my laptop, adjusted the built-in camera, and logged on to the secure video feed. One by one, the icons for the independent board members lit up on the dual monitors. There was the chairman, adjusting his heavy reading glasses. Linda Foster, a notoriously sharp director from the New York finance sector. And the company's general counsel, a man who usually opened these high-stakes meetings with an awkward tension-breaking joke. Finally, the central tile expanded, and Julian appeared. He was sitting in his executive office, the Manhattan skyline glowing like a network of gold circuitry through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him. He had tried to fix his appearance, but I could see the subtle fractures in his armor. His tie was gone, the top button of his designer shirt was undone, and his hair was slightly disheveled. For a man who had spent his entire life mastering the art of the flawless public appearance, he suddenly looked remarkably ordinary. He looked tired. The moment my video tile activated, showing me sitting calmly at my kitchen table in a simple navy, sweater with a glass of water beside me, the entire virtual boardroom went completely, violently quiet. Nobody spoke. The general counsel cleared his throat, entirely forgetting his opening joke. Julian leaned toward his camera, his eyes widening in a mixture of profound panic and intense corporate calculation. He forced a soft, patronizing smile onto his face, trying to project a sense of calm authority for the benefit of the other directors. "Emma," he said, his voice dropping into that smooth, intimate baritone he always used when he was trying to manage my emotions. "I didn't expect you to log in tonight, sweetie. You really don't need to stress yourself with this. This is just a standard technical vote for our institutional expansion portfolio. We have the day-to-day logistics completely handled. Why don't you log off, get some rest, and we can talk through the details at home later tonight." I looked directly into the lens of my camera. I didn't blink. I didn't let a single trace of marital heartbreak touch my features. "I am exactly where I need to be, Julian," I answered, my voice cutting through the digital audio line with a flat, clinical precision that made the chairman sit up a little straighter in his chair. The chairman adjusted his glasses again, looking down at his digital agenda packet. "Well, since Mrs. Carter is present, we will proceed with the formal roll call. We've received the formal notice that Victoria Blake's investment group is prepared to execute the $250 million capital injection, which will restructure the primary equity allocation of Harlow Reed Technologies. Under standard corporate governance, we require a majority vote to authorize the new share issuance." "Before the board takes that vote," I said, my voice cutting off the chairman before he could call for a motion, "I am executing a formal non-negotiable priority veto on behalf of Carter Family Holdings." Julian's face drained of color so fast it was almost satisfying to watch. He gripped the edge of his mahogany desk, leaning so close to his microphone that his audio clipped. "Emma, stop this. You don't know what you're doing. You have operational strategy rights, but you cannot just halt an institutional capital event based on personal, emotional whims. There are procedures, there are obligations, there are market clauses." "There are clauses, Julian," I corrected him, my voice remaining entirely level, entirely cold, "and you signed them 14 years ago." I gestured slightly to Martin Keller, who was sitting just out of frame at my kitchen table. With a single click, Martin uploaded a scanned historical document directly into the shared Boardroom media folder. "If the directors will open file Appendix Alpha 1, I continued calmly, "you will find the original anti-dilution priority bylaws structured at the inception of this firm. Under these specific covenants, which were backed by my father's original seed capital, Carter Family Holdings does not just possess a standard majority stake. We hold an immutable, defensive veto over any structural recapitalization, share dilution, or executive restructuring that threatens the original equity block. I am executing that right effective immediately. The digital boardroom turned into an absolute vacuum of sound. Several directors stared blankly at their screens, their fingers frantically clicking to open the document Martin had uploaded. Julian sat entirely frozen in his high-backed leather chair, his mouth slightly parted. For years, he had built his career on fluid movement. If a conversation got uncomfortable, he would effortlessly pivot. If a question got too precise, he would charm his way out of it. But right now, he was cornered by a mathematical and legal reality he couldn't talk his way out of. The smooth, untouchable corporate mastermind completely ran out of adjectives. Linda Foster was the first to speak, her voice sharp and entirely transactional. Mr. Carter, is this document authentic? Did you conceal an anti-dilution veto structure from the primary investors during this entire round? Julian tried to speak, but his voice sounded thin, stripped of all its magnetic resonance. It's an old family artifact. It was written when we were a 12-person startup. It was never intended to block institutional growth. It was intended to block fraud, Julian, I interrupted, closing my laptop's secondary data tab. The veto stands. The capital injection is frozen, and I am formally requesting the independent board members to initiate an immediate internal review into executive misconduct and the unauthorized dilution of company assets. The general counsel didn't even hesitate. Realizing the massive legal liability looming over the firm, he looked directly into his camera. Given this disclosure, I recommend we table the restructuring vote immediately and place the chief executive on administrative leave pending a full internal inquiry. One by one, the board members nodded their heads in agreement. The meeting was adjourned in under 20 minutes. Later that evening, around 10:15, my phone buzzed again. It wasn't Julian. The caller ID showed Victoria Blake. I hesitated for a brief second before sliding the bar to answer. Emma. Victoria's voice came through the speaker. It sounded nothing like it did during our formal corporate dinners. The polished, aggressive edge was completely gone. She sounded small, fragile, and utterly stunned. I know I probably have no right to call you right now, but I need you to know. I didn't know about the veto. I didn't know about any of it. I leaned against my kitchen counter, watching the moonlight reflect off the quiet Westport Street outside. I believe you didn't know about the veto, Victoria. But you knew he had a wife. There was a sharp, ragged intake of breath on the other end of the line. He told me you were completely separated. He said the divorce paperwork was just stuck in a legal logjam because of old family holding paperwork. Emma, he even showed me an apartment lease. He took me there. He told me it was his place. I stared at the wall, a sudden, heavy wave of realization washing over me. Julian hadn't rented that downtown apartment because he needed a place to live. He had rented it to support a beautiful, elaborate lie. Every late-night strategy session, every weekend trip he claimed was for investor relations. He had surrounded his betrayal with just enough physical evidence to make it look legitimate to a sharp, calculating woman like Victoria. She wasn't a cartoonish villain who had come to steal my life. She was simply another person standing in the wreckage of a highly calculated performance. At 1:45, the headlights of a single car swept across the kitchen ceiling as it pulled into the driveway at an unnatural angle. A minute later, a heavy, desperate knock sounded at the front door. I didn't rush to answer it. I walked into the foyer slowly, Murphy padding quietly at my side, his tail low. Through the sidelight window, I saw Julian standing on the porch. He looked entirely diminished. The biting February wind was blowing his collar open. His shoulders were slumped, and his hands were stuffed deep into his coat pockets. The unshakable confidence that had defined him for 14 years had completely leaked out, and without it, he looked strangely small. Like a stranger wearing my husband's clothes. I unlocked the heavy wooden front door and opened it, but I left the security chain firmly in place. Julian looked at the brass links between us, then up at my face. Emma, he whispered, his voice cracking against the cold air. The board placed me on leave. Victoria's lawyers are pulling her fund entirely. The firm is destabilizing. People are going to lose their jobs. Good people with families, with mortgages. Please, just open the door. This corporate blockade, it's a massive strategic misunderstanding of the company's pacing. We can fix this inside. I looked at him through the narrow gap. The old Emma, the woman who had spent over a decade softening every hard truth so he could step comfortably around it, would have unlatched that chain. She would have mistaken his panic for genuine remorse and his desperation for love. But the woman standing here tonight had watched too much burn to confuse smoke with warmth. You aren't worried about the employees' mortgages, Julian, I said, my voice completely devoid of anger, carrying only the weight of absolute acceptance. And you aren't sorry because you hurt me. You are only sorry because your map finally stopped working. He swallowed hard, his eyes filling with tears that felt entirely real to him, but entirely irrelevant to me. Are you divorcing me? He asked, the word hanging heavily between us. Yes, I replied. It didn't feel dramatic or triumphant. It felt administrative, like finally putting a name on a document that had been quietly drafted by years of small, silent humiliations I had chosen not to count. And the company? He whispered, his face crumpling. What happens to the empire? I looked at him one last time, seeing right through the polished mask to the empty space where his integrity should have been. The company, Julian, I said softly, was never yours. I closed the door gently, slid the deadbolt into place, and stood there in the quiet foyer as he knocked once, twice, then stopped. A few moments later, his car door slammed, and he drove away into the dark. The divorce took months, as real divorces always do. Because of the ironclad prenuptial agreements and the original holding company structures my father had put in place, the legal process was surprisingly straightforward. The civil claims regarding unauthorized corporate actions were settled quietly through negotiated restructuring, permanent restrictions on Julian's executive authority, and an absolute return of my family's historical equity control. But as I sat on the deck of a small, quiet cottage by the coast 3 months later, watching the first true signs of spring push through the thawing soil, I realized that true justice doesn't arrive in a crowded courtroom or a chaotic shouting match. It arrives in carefully numbered pages. It arrives the day you stop measuring your future by someone else's betrayal. The board eventually asked if I wanted to step into the spotlight and take the public title of CEO. Years earlier, I might have accepted without hesitation just to prove a point. Instead, I surprised everyone, including myself, and said no. I chose the role of executive chair instead, focusing entirely on macro strategy and launching a new early-stage incubator program to fund healthcare technology built by women and underrepresented innovators who had spent far too long building in the shadows. I left the public daily operations to Victoria, who had been fully reinstated after an independent ethics review proved she had been entirely deceived rather than complicit. We never became close friends, but we shared an unspoken respect born from the wreckage of the same beautiful lie. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the warm morning sunshine on my face, and I looked out at the open horizon. I had spent 14 years believing that my value was tied to how useful I could be to someone else's dream. But as the waves crashed gently against the shore, I made a final promise to myself. Never confuse being needed with being valued. They are not the same thing. Julian lost his marriage because he chose deception over honesty. He lost his career because he chose ambition over integrity. But as for me, I didn't win because he lost. I won because I finally remembered that my worth had never depended on whether he was capable of recognizing it. Sometimes, the strongest revenge isn't destroying the person who hurt you. It is refusing to let their choices destroy the person you were always meant to become.